Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting us to speak. My name is MaryAnn Tenuto-Sanchez, and I'm a member of the Chiapas Support Committee. I'll tell you a little about what the Chiapas Support Committee does, and then you'll sort of know what my qualifications are for speaking. The Chiapas Support Committee works with the region in Zapatista territory called La Garrucha, which is the name of their headquarters community. We've worked in that region since 1998, and specifically what we've done is we've worked with the Zapatista civilian communities to help them construct like their economy, their schools, their clinics, and so forth. I personally had a very close relationship with one of the autonomous Zapatista counties when we worked on a couple of really big projects with them, very directly and very hands-on, and I learned a lot from them. So with that, I think what I'll do is just give a little overview of what we're going to talk about. Arnoldo is going to talk about the origins of the Zapatistas, and then I will go into a bit about their structure, which kind of encompasses a lot, but which I had a really close relationship with when I worked on projects. And then both of us are going to talk about what the Zapatistas are doing currently, what the current project is. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Arnoldo and let him introduce himself and get into the origins of the Zapatistas.
So good morning, everyone. My name is Arnoldo Garcia, and back in 1993, I was part of a national network for immigrant refugee rights. At that time, we were having a really big fight against the ratification of the North American Free Trade Agreement. And the hallmark of the Free Trade Agreement was that it was a culminating point of a neoliberal stage or agenda of capitalism. And when we were fighting against NAFTA, it provided a very unusual scenario because the left and right converged. A lot of people, this grates against a lot of people's ears, right? I was reading the statement about the Syrian in your window, right? This is the sort of thing that I'm talking about. So the left and right converged in NAFTA because both sides left off the issue of the rights of immigrant workers, of migrant workers. The environmentalists and labor sold out migrant workers, they sold out their base too, for that matter, for a short-term thing. And then what happened was that they both also said the burden of the displacement of the displacement is going to be borne by the migrant workers themselves. In other words, screw them, they're going to have to pay for the costs for the problem of being displaced by our development of capitalism, of NAFTA. So the reason I bring up NAFTA, right, because when almost everybody, excluding maybe the migrant networks and the indigenous communities, and unbeknownst to the world, right, on January 1st, when NAFTA is implemented, the EZLN appears, right, in an uprising saying that NAFTA represented a death sentence for indigenous communities. So back then, the Zapatistas already had a strategy in place about what they're going to do when their uprising happened. And they created a network in the US it was the only Zapatista that didn't wear a ski mask. And she helped organize a network. I was invited to it. There's a lot of people that were invited to participate in that. And then we went to Chiapas to go meet with the communities, go meet with other organizers. Now, this is in 1994. And to look at the task of organizing solidarity. And that's how I got involved in this, and it was called the National Commission for Democracy in Mexico. And that's also how I met MaryAnn a couple of years later or so, and when we were forming the network and we were mobilizing. The thing that came up the most for me at that point is that it really, two things. One, that really unmasked the anti-Mexican racism in the U.S. It's a very, in the Southwest, it's probably unperceptible to most people because it's just such an ordinary, everyday type of activity. So the way it took place, right, was that the Solidarity movement at the time, which was mainly white, it was facing a different monster. In other words, the wars in Central America, the National Liberation Fronts, the way they did politics was way different than the way the Zapatistas, the National Liberation Front, the Zapatistas did politics. So there was a lot of reticence and hesitancy and reluctance, and also just like, hell no, I'm not going to take leadership from a Mexican in the U.S. on how to do solidarity with Mexicans, because the Zapatistas saying, you want to do solidarity with us? Do it right here. You don't have to go to Chiapas. You can support the day laborers. You can support the indigenous struggles here. You know, there's different ways of doing it. But the conception of solidarity was that it was professionalized, so forth. So the reason I'm saying that is that just to give you an idea of the origins of the Zapatistas. So there's three big roots that the Zapatistas have. One is that indigenous communities in Mexico have always been at the forefront of the major historic changes that happened in Mexico, from independence, the fight against Spain and Spanish colonialism, to the fight against neocolonialism when the French invaded Mexico because they were coming up to how do you say, cash in on loans, right? And they were hired as an army. Napoleon's armies were hired as an army to come and collect the debt, and they were imposing a monarchy in Mexico. That was in the 1860s. And then again in 1910, when they overthrew a 35-year-old dictatorship, it was indigenous communities that led the fight and the struggle. And there's the same thing that happened against NAFTA. What I was saying earlier, and I didn't finish the thought, was that when January 1st happened, everybody was saying, oh, we're going to monitor the human rights abuses. We're going to see what happens to labor in Mexico. We're going to see if there's displacement and blah, blah, blah. And the Zapatistas, what did they do? The indigenous communities, they came out fighting. They came out with their guns roaring. They had been preparing for this for more than 10 years. They had been building their community-based army for more than 10 years. So how did this come about? In the late 1960s, a group of young organizers, mainly communists, people who were in different parts of the communist left and the pro-Cuban, for lack of a better category, pro-Cuban, left, and also based on the inspiration that many received because of Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, the July 26th movement, the rebel army of the Cubans, and then the sort of the way it really changed everybody's view of how do we actually destroy capitalism, how do we actually overthrow it. And it comes out of a very long, for us that have studied Bolshevism, right, there's the same thing. It's not just arms, it's not just an army, it's communities, it's workers, it's indigenous people. In the Soviet Union they called them peasants, but they were really indigenous people. How do we overthrow this hydra head of capitalism? So based on that, right, and what was happening in Mexico, and also Mexico has a long, long history of armed struggle. It's not something that has been done by groups of people that go to the mountains. Though by that time, because of the inspiration of the Cuban Revolution, that was sort of the conception of how you went to the mountains. And some of it was also for safety and security reasons, that you really couldn't. It was very difficult and has always been almost impossible to organize an armed movement in the cities, right? Because there's so much surveillance. Our movements are infiltrated by police. Like whether it's the fight against Katrina, AIM, the Black Panthers, you name it, the Brown Berets, the Mechas, the student movements. We were all infiltrated by police agents. Some of them became prominent leaders, even so. So the Zapatistas had learned that lesson very, very early on about how they were going to do it. So, for example, in 1969, they formed the FLN, the National Liberation Front. Is that right? Front or Force?
Flares.
Yeah, the Forces of National Liberation. Because the reason the Forces of National Liberation, they had a conception, right, of like a vanguard conception of how you would lead an armed movement to overthrow the state. And it takes in a very peculiar juncture why a group of young men sign a pact that says, later on it's a pact to the death, right? They signed a statement that nobody gives up, nobody turns away, nobody retreats. What had happened in 1968, 50 years ago, is that the Mexican government had tried to literally wipe out the student movement. There was a massacre of students that happened in October of 1968, where they massacred at least 400 students, maybe more, disappeared hundreds of activists, and just went out to really commit genocide against the social justice movements. And that's something that was very different, right? So then the conditions of repression were really intense. So there was very little space for organizing, in other words, for legal organizing. And even less space for illegal organizing. In terms of a lot of things have to be done in secret because there was a lot of repression. So in that condition, right, the people decided to form the FLN. And that's in 1969. From 1969 to 1974, is that the approximately. So in that period of formation, right, because they do it underground, you know, they have their safe houses, they have their supporters, they're building their army. But at the same time, there's other formations that come out. One in particular that I know a lot about is that it was called the, what was the Liga 29 de Septiembre they call it? The Communist League 29 September. And they were crazy. They were called the sick ones. And in the communist movement, for example, because of the structure of the parties within I know this from talking to some of the members, right, in the past, is that they did not, the communist bigwigs in Mexico would send their children abroad to the Soviet Union to study, or to Cuba, or maybe to the US, right, because what happened is the communist youth were going into this formation, and they were insurrectionists. They were robbing banks, you know, they were trying to overthrow the state, they were attacking military garrisons. They were, you know, they said, we want to destroy capitalism. But what happened was that gave a lot of space to the state, and they were hunted down, and they were hunting down everybody. And then the FLN at that time, they had already learned the lessons of doing the spectacular actions. So they said, we're gonna grow by night. We're gonna accumulate silently without nobody knowing about us. We're not gonna tell anybody. Maybe we'll fail, and nobody will ever know that we sacrificed years of our lives doing this. But what happened? One of their safe houses was in Monterrey, right? So a lot of cars from out of state would come in with different license plates, and neighbors noticed, and they said, oh my God, drug traffickers. So they called the police on them, and then there was an intersection, right? So, and they killed a lot of people. There was a gunfight. Some of their main leaders were killed. They got dispersed. And I can't remember the chronology exactly, whether it was right before then. Yeah, right before that happened, they had already sent their first group of people into Chiapas, into the mountains. And I think you might have to clarify later on, but anyway, they went to Chiapas. They were also hunted down. There was some kind of shootouts. They were killed. And then what happened was that the groups were dispersed, and the members were dispersed because they were on the ground. And they were looking for each other, trying to find each other. Some went to prison. A lot of people went to prison. A lot of people got killed and disappeared. But they never gave up the fact that this is what they had decided to do. So by that time, by the early 80s, they had regrouped, and they sent the second column into Chiapas. Another thing that happened in 1974 was that the indigenous communities where the Zapatistas would land eventually, they were also in a type of political retreat. They had a big conference that was a public conference that was held with the diocese of the very important bishop. I just blanked on his name.
Reese?
Yeah, Bishop Reese, who was a liberation theologist. And what he did is when he was mandated to organize this conference, he invited a lot of young activists and organizers to help him organize it, right? So a lot of Maoists, some Trotskyists, maybe some Stalinists, but a lot of Maoists came into it because they believed you have to organize the peasants in their view, or our view sometimes, about how and so in that retreat, right, in 1974, they had come to a conclusion. They had tried everything and nothing was working. They had elected their own party officials, their own elected officials. They had done this, that. They had set up, state-run clinics, and nothing was working. Everything got worse or remained the same. And they said, we're going to step back and not do anything. I mean, not do anything with the system. So there was this sort of an intersection that happened between what was happening to the left in general and the armed left in particular, what was happening to the communities. So this is the second big seed, right? One was that there's a long memory, and it's still there, about how communities can organize themselves and defend themselves. The second one was that you can't do it alone. Communities can't do it alone, and the left, no matter how smart or brilliant you are, you can't do it alone. So in the mountains, they met each other, right? And what happens is that if your community has lived hundreds or maybe thousands of years in the same area, which is the case, you're going to notice who comes in and out. So when the Zapatistas snuck into the rainforest, right, because they were having that strategy of like the Cubans and the other Sandinistas, and a lot of the people tried that. There was enough wisdom and understanding. The community said, leave them alone. They're up to good. We'll talk to them when they're ready, right? And they're doing their training, they're building, and they're sneaking in guns, whatever what a guerrilla army does. And eventually they came down to liberate the people, right? And the people were waiting for them, and they were applauding them, because that's how you greet people. And they were applauding them. They come into where they're coming into, and they said, welcome. And that changed their whole, that changed them, sorry. I put that so I wouldn't talk forever like I'm doing. So that changed them forever, right? Because it changed, what happened was that the Zapatistas had to change their whole conception of who they were, how they were going to do their work of organizing and revolution. And they realized, and then they became a community-based army that followed the leadership of the communities. And they have a structure it's a civilian structure and a military structure. So that when, by the time 1994 comes around, right, they had already created a structure, right, because they knew the Geneva, convention codes of how you become recognized as a forgot the word, a party in a conflict. There's a certain concept, right? They're already ready, so they have a structure where it's an army, has, in their case, has comandantes, subcomandantes, and so forth, all the way down to the insurgents. And they also have a national guard and so forth. That we'll talk more about the structure, right? So in 1983, right, when they actually formed the Easy Line officially on November 17th, 1983. November 17th is the date of the Mexican Revolution. The Mexican Revolution began on November 17th, 1910. So they were really clear on their purpose, right? What their goal was, their strategy was going to be. And the thing that became more and more clear was that as soon as they started recruiting indigenous leaders into the structure, that changed them, that they could not operate as a force, like less so the Cubans, more so like the Sandinistas, where they were more, a top-down, we'll solve everything in you, as opposed to bottom-up, we can solve this here in this community, and we're here to serve, not to lead. We're here to propose, not impose, and so forth. And this comes from the communities. So then they begin a deliberation, right? What do they need? How are they going to be prepared? Because to go to war is a really big decision. It can't be made by the army. It can't be made by the adults. It can't be made by the elders. It has to be made by everyone. So that's something to deliberate. What are we going to do? How are we going to do it? So when they started seeing NAFTA being, because they noticed the more so than the U.S., right? With Reagan happening in 1980, and the Reaganomics is what we call neoliberalism in the U.S., and that's how it begins in the U.S. We call it Reaganomics. And abroad, more people, the other political cultures abroad are much more savvy than ours, much more mature, so they're more likely to call it neoliberalism than Reaganomics. But it's the same difference. So in 1983, we're in Mexico. There's a really big privatization of the banks because of the pressure of the U.S. Mexico says if you want to keep this cushy relationship with the U.S., you're going to have to join this free trade agreement. At that point, it was just Canada and Mexico, the North American. It was called a free trade agreement. Then Mexico was onboarded in 1986. And what happened in 1986, right, was that's the first time there was a landslide victory that was stolen. So of all the restructuring that was happening, right, the PRI had split, the left, had been decimated, and they were forming their own parties and trying to be, above ground organizations. They were coming out of the prisons, and they formed what was at that point called it was something like the National Democratic Front. And it consisted of Cuauhtemoc Cárdenas, and the people had split off from the PRI, the ruling party. People that were from the ex-guerrilla movement that had formed their own political organizations, other small parties, and they won the 1986 elections, but it was stolen from them, outright stolen, right? No, I'm talking about 1988. 1986 were state elections, where the PAN, the right-wing party, won the elections, right? But they were also stolen because of the free trade agreement undergoing, and Reagan intervened and was allowed the PRI to quash the elections. So there was a really big shift, right? So 1986 was a really big lesson, and they were not able to ever win, right, because of the way the system was made up. And so between 1983 and 1994, the restructuring of our economies reached a whole new height, right? Just like we're right now, we're at another cusp of a very big culmination of transformation. So they're keeping track of what's happening in the U.S. And then a few things happen. They have some military encounter skirmishes with the Mexican army right before the free trade agreement is signed. The Mexican army and the Mexican government does not say anything. They say it was just drug dealers, drug traffickers. They don't say, oh my God, we've run into a big problem. There's a community-based army there, and it's huge and it's well organized, and they thought if we announce that, this will really impact the free trade agreement. So they didn't say anything about it. And then so the hand was dealt to the Zapatistas, where they had to say, if we don't do something about this, there's a possibility that they're going to try to wipe us out like they've done before to all the other movements. And then with the free trade agreement, right, it's a very victory. The Mexican government is not expecting it. Surprise attack. And on January 1st, boom, they take over, some major, what in Mexico, what in the US we'd call counties, municipalidades. My Spanish is still with me. And then, of course, everybody says, easy land, and they're saying, we're going to march. We're asking everybody to rise up, and let's head towards the capital and take over. Right? That's how the structure is. It's much more complicated history, because some of this, you can actually see a lot of what I'm describing on YouTube. There's a lot of things with English subtitles, so you can read about the history of the FLN, or see about the history of the FLN, the EZLN, some of the things I've mentioned about the indigenous movements, right up to the present. And that's a third thing that's a hallmark of the Zapatismo. One was the indigenous base of the liberation movements. Second is Zapata, and then the third thing was that how successful movements have always been led by people, not necessarily by organizations or by vanguards, and that we have an example, still a living, breathing example, and they continue doing that. So in 1994, what did they do, right? They had been ready for this. They knew that organizing in the U.S. was not a task that the left was up to, and that they had to go from the grassroots, right? Because all the people they invited to form the commission, with a few exceptions, a few notables, were all grassroots people. Because we know that the grass people understand the NAFTA, and they understand the business community, because they are our counterparts. So they identified, for example, the immigrant communities as their one-to-one counterpart, because the majority of immigrants are not immigrants, they're indigenous people. And once you understand that, right, once you make that conceptual change in your understanding of people, then they don't become objects, they become subjects. And then they become self-determined objects that they can make decisions for themselves. And they can decide, what do I risk? What do I want? How do I get it? And who am I going to work with? And how are they going to work with me? And how am I going to work with them? So the Zapatistas, right, they spend, and they continue spending a lot of time in assemblies like this, where they just talk it out. They talk about what it means, any kind of decision that's of big impact, and even a small impact. They will talk out their decisions, and it's not like, this was one of the things about, Marcos, people think, oh, he's the leader, he's a mestizo, he's got green eyes, he's white. Well, and those were all racist comments, because all those comments were about Indian people can't do this for themselves. Indian people can't think. Indian people can't analyze. Indian people can't organize, Indian people can't destroy capitalism, Indian people blah, 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 right? And the same thing happened to us here when we were trying to organize solidarity. It was like Mexicans. And that was it, right? But the thing is that it's a really hard thing for us to talk about and overcome, and then figure out how do we connect. Because this is the last thing I'll say, right? The fourth thing is that there's a lot of Mexicans in the U.S. The old communists and the old socialists and left movements and parties, they used to have an agreement with some of the people that organize here that we used to say that you have the right to come and organize here, and that we'll support you to work with you to organize here, right? And some of that was because of the racism, some of it was because of the old style of vanguardism, party buildingism, and some of it was because us left and communists didn't know how to organize. Maybe we still don't know, but it's a challenge, right? And then there was part of us in the U.S., right, that we say, and I still believe, and we organize that way, right, that in order for the democratic revolution, the democratic movement to succeed in the U.S., the democratic movement and organizations have to succeed in Mexico, because there's a bond between us. So if you study capital, the first time that capital is invested abroad the way we understand it today was in 1825 in Mexico. The U.S. capitalists invested in Mexico in 1825. And then when that capital got invested in Mexico, it created something that's called fusion capital. So Mexican capital, U.S. capital has this very specific quality that you don't find anywhere else. That it has a very peculiar quality. So then, as a result, there's this place called a Mexica. If I was a nationalist, I would say that's Aztlan. That's my country. That's because of the peculiar nature of how our countries are fusing together, and you feel it, right? But it's not Aztlan, right? Because anywhere we go to, it's Indian land. Whether it's here, Ohlone land, where we're at right now, or if you go to southeast Mexico, where there's dozens of Indian nations. So it's it's like, how do we unweave that? How do we build power? How do we organize? And as Zapatistas, we're successful in that way, right? Because they had to unweave themselves from structures that said, no, this is the way you do business, this is how you lead. From other structures said, no, you got to do it with the parties. You're going to get 5% registered. You got to go to the elections. The PR and the PAN were full of communists and leftists and socialists because they had built a corporatist, how do you say in English, a corporate style of capitalism, right? That if you really want to be involved in politics, just like in the U.S., if you want to really be involved in politics, you got to belong to Republicans or Democrats. There, you had to belong to the PRI or the PAN. You couldn't the PAN to a less extent, but mainly the PRI. So even when we were organized against free trade, and we go meet with like the people in the PRI, which were on the left wing, you'd say, I'm a communist. They would say, I'm a socialist, but I can't do anything because, I do it, then I'm iced, I don't have anything. But that was a way of justifying, the politics, the class politics of the structure, right? That you could be a communist and not really, and not suffer any consequences for it. Not that I think communists should suffer consequences, but I think that there has to be like a really clear cultural, political, structural way where you get integrated into the class. And that's what the Zapatistas, they integrated themselves into the community and they became part of the community, and they are part of the community. So that's the last thing I'll say. I already talked too much anyway.
Wow.
Please, I would urge you not to applaud, because my grandfather said, if you applaud too early, you might regret it later.
Oh, but it was too good not to say something back to you.
No, I know, thank you.
Yeah.
We have to have a little humor.
I'm not laughing.
I'm going to talk about the structure of the Zapatistas, and I have a favor to ask of you. Apparently, 2 documents that I was going to use for my talk got mixed up with the stuff that I sent around. One of them is called Zapatista Structure, and another one is called the 13th Stele. And if anybody has one of those, if you could please give it back to me, it would be extremely helpful in presenting what I have to say.
13th what?
Stele, S-T-E-L-E, which is a comunicado that came out.
So we're supposed to have this one, is it?
Yeah, yeah. It's something entirely different. If nobody has it, that's fine. I can live without it. I want to talk a little bit about how the Zapatistas are structured, because they're very different from a lot of other groups. And as Arnoldo said, they're very bottom up. So the first choice that people who joined the Zapatista movement had was what role they would play in the movement. And they had a choice of joining the three different parts of Zapatismo. They could become an insurgent, and this applied to both men and women. The insurgents were the actual fighters, military fighters, in the military wing of the Zapatistas. They could be a civilian support base, and those were the hundreds of thousands of folks in the communities that stayed in their communities. Thank you. I got one of them. What their role was to support the insurgents. In other words, give them food, give them shelter when they needed it, and so forth, because the insurgents were not in the civilian communities. They were off in military encampments all throughout Zapatista territory. Then there was a third choice, which is kind of the one that's most interesting to me, and those are the milicianos. There's no good English translation, so I'm going to tell you kind of like what they did. The milicianos are part National Guard because they have military training, but like our National Guard, they work their fields during the week and lead a civilian life. The command, the top authority, the comandancia of the EZLN is called the Indigenous Revolutionary Clandestine Committee, and it's made up of all the commanders who are the milicianos. All the commanders are milicianos. They're part civilian, they are not insurgents, and they're part National Guard. What the other role that the milicianos play is that they're political operatives. They go around organizing in the communities. They sometimes play a role in resolving disputes between one community and another. And they kind of like are responsible for seeing that the communities, the civilians, carry out like the policies of the overall the CCRI, the Clandestine Committee. So that was the first choice that people had. Then after the uprising, there of course was a lot of Mexican army went down to Chiapas and started their repression, bombing the communities and things like that. That didn't last very long because civil society rose up and told the government to cut it out. And they did. And there were some peace talks afterwards that didn't go very far. And so there was a military circle around Zapatista territory, and in December of 1994, the Zapatistas announced that they had formed 38 autonomous municipios, or I'm going to call them counties, just so that you get a visual image of what it's like. What is an autonomous county? It's really one of the key elements in the way the Zapatistas are organized internally. An autonomous county is just like a county or city government here, but it is a parallel authority to the official constitutional counties throughout that same territory. In other words, let's say that Alameda County developed some cities that wanted to become autonomous. And let's say we had Oakland,